So we've got our dedicated server all built locally and working. The next step is to basically put this into a form factor of what is known as a Docker image. And this will allow us to run that image in Kubernetes in Google Cloud once we have all of our deployment stages set up. Now, just a heads up, you're going to need quite a bit of disk space and a bit of time and some patience thrown in there, because it can take a while to build these Docker images. The Docker images themselves can be built using a CLI tool. A lot of this work is all built from a person called Adam Rehn, who's basically put all this stuff together and figured out how to build Docker images with Unreal Engine. Now, if you look at some of the supported host configurations that is in the extensive documentation that Adam Rehn's put together, you'll notice a few sort of optimality sort of descriptions around what operating systems work best when building these images. For our example, we're going to be using Linux as the host OS. Even though we're running Windows right now, what we're going to do is actually install the Windows subsystem for Linux. This will allow us to run Ubuntu on our local machine, which will allow us to then basically have Linux available to us when building these Docker images. So the steps are, we have to install the Windows subsystem for Linux, basically get Ubuntu up and running locally. The next step after that would be to install Docker for Windows, which then works with the Windows subsystem for Linux. And then after that, we can then use the CLI tool UE4 Docker that Adam Rehn's put together that will allow us to build these Docker images so that we have them locally. This part is the part that takes the longest. It takes a while to build the images, and it takes quite a bit of disk space. As you can see, a minimum of 300 gigabyte of available disk space will be needed in order to build these images. Alright, so I'm just going to quickly run through the Windows subsystem for Linux installation guide. It's a good guide, it doesn't take long, but ultimately we need this installed so that we can get Ubuntu running on our Windows machine locally. So we're just going to go through the manual steps because they're quite straightforward. It's pretty much a few copy and paste commands and then we'll be up and running. We're going to be running WSL2, the latest version. What you'll need to do to get going is literally get to Windows PowerShell and run as administrator. And then ultimately you can copy and paste the first command to enable WSL. Copy and paste. This will enable the feature. You can check the requirements. I'm presuming that you are on Windows 10 as you're working through these videos, but it's worth just checking the docs around this just to make sure that you're all good to go to be able to run WSL2. Enable the virtual machine feature. Again, a simple copy and paste. And then we move down to downloading the Linux kernel update package. So you just need to download that. It's a small install. And away you go, and then set the default version for WSL to be version 2. The last thing you need to do is then go through and pick from the Microsoft Store itself the Linux OS that you wish to run. In our case, we're going to be using Ubuntu. So search for Ubuntu and get that installed. You'll then get a desktop shortcut, which I've pinned mine down to the bottom taskbar down here, just for ease of use, and we're going to be using it quite a lot, so you might want to pin that. And that's basically getting Windows subsystem up and running. You should end up with a result like this. When you run Ubuntu, you're opened up and you get your home directory, and basically you can then start running all of your different Linux commands. Okay, next up on the list to install is Docker for Windows. It's a simple installer, it's a single executable you can just run, it'll install everything you need and you'll be ready to go. For all the documentation that I'm going through in regards to installation instructions, I'll be putting that in the description below just for ease of use and quick links. But all you gotta do is simply download, run the installer, and then ultimately, because I've already got it installed, you'll end up with Docker Desktop, which will start up, and in your bottom right of your taskbar, it will start the Docker engine for you in Windows. One thing to just make sure you enable or selected when you were installing is just to make sure that in your settings tab for general that you use the WSL2 based engine to provide better performance when running Docker for Windows. Okay, now it's time to do the sort of final steps. and basically get the CLI that allows us to build these Docker images installed into Ubuntu. So the first thing we're going to want to do is obviously ensure that Docker for Windows is running, which it should be after your install. The next thing will be to start up Ubuntu. So click your shortcut and get it up and running. And then ultimately there's a quick guide once again, really good guide from Adam Rehn on this stuff. Basically you just need to copy and paste these commands. We're basically running Ubuntu, so there's specific instructions for this on configuring Linux, but ultimately you can do the old copy and paste, put in the relevant password. I've already got those installed, and then there's basically a Python pip package that you can then install as well. So if we do that, head back to Ubuntu, copy and paste, and basically we're saying that we're already there. And then once you've done that, you can then run the setup command, and away we go. But all we need to do is run UE4-Docker -build and then the Unreal Engine version we wish to build. So basically go to Ubuntu and run in UE4-Docker, and we're going to be building the version which we specified in our previous videos as 4.26.2. Now I would recommend maybe doing this overnight or in a time where you do not need your machine for a while. When I did this on the original execution of it, it took roughly, I think, around about 2 hours on this PC. I think it can probably take 2 to 4 depending on your specs, but ultimately once you run this, you then need to provide Git credentials that will be used to clone the UE4 repo. Now you can use the account that we created in the previous videos when we were getting set up with GitHub and actually pulling the Unreal Engine from source in the very first video. So for me it's trashart-demo, and then I put in my password, and then ultimately if all is well and good, you should see it basically get to this point and clone the repository successfully. Leave that for however many hours it takes to build these images, and then we can jump back into the video and actually then start packaging up our dedicated server using the Docker images now been built. Okay, so the Docker images are now built, and now we're ready to use them to actually now build our dedicated server using a Docker image rather than our local Windows environment. So the first thing we're going to need to do is basically go into our project file, and what we're going to do is create a Docker file. A Docker file basically is a file that states how you wish to build your image, and basically you put in essence commands or a little bit of syntax configuration that then Docker will understand and then build that image for you. So to do this, we're going to basically first off create a Docker file that's going to build the dedicated server for Linux. So let me open up Visual Studio. And what we're going to do in the root of our project for the Unreal game itself, so versus game Unreal, we're going to create a couple of new files. We'll create an empty text document. We're just going to call this for now dockerfile.server. And we'll say yes, we want to change it. Not too worried about that extension. And then the other file we're going to need, and you can think of this file that we're going to create as similar to the .gitignore. Dockerignore ensures that when it builds its context, when you build the image, it doesn't include files that it doesn't need to know about. So let's create that file as well. Dockerignore. Awesome. I'm just going to regenerate the Visual Studio project files just so that the solution then can see them. It'll ask us to reload the solution once this happens, and we'll just do reload all. And now we can see that we have a dockerfile.server and a dockerignore. Well, it's a bit of a tongue twister. So ultimately now we can add in the relevant configuration. Again, just to save a bit of time and rather than you having to watch me type, I've got an example of one that I created earlier. Again, I'll put a link in the description, but ultimately this is literally just listing out files, extensions and folders that should not be included in the Docker context. In our dockerfile.server, what we're going to do is basically take the other examples I've pre-made, and we can go through it line by line just to sort of understand what's going on. So once you've built your Docker images, you've got a list of them here. If you just search for Adam in here, you'll bring up the list of them. The UE4 image is what we're going to be using to basically build our project. And ultimately, we have that here, and we denote the tag that we want to use, which you can see here, which is the Unreal Engine version of 4.26.2. And this is a multi-stage build Docker file, which I won't go too much detail, but ultimately we're saying we're going to use this image as the builder, and we're going to copy the dot, which is basically stands for the current directory, all of its files into a folder within the Docker container of /tmp/project. And obviously this command here will basically set the permissions to be the UE4 user that's part of this Docker image. Once it's copied those files, it will then set the working directory to the temp project folder, as this is where we want to sort of run our UE4 package commands. Now the next one we see is run, which basically is just running a command. And you'll notice it's using a CLI tool called UE4. And then the next argument is package. And then we're saying what target, and we're denoting that it wants to be a server build and no client. So what that UE4 CLI relates to is basically within the container, it has already installed for us the UE4 CLI, and it is using the package command from this CLI. There's some documentation around this on the Adam Rehn docs that can go through more detail what you can pass through to it. But for this example, we're basically wanting to build a development server for now so that we can have logging and all the other goodness so that we can debug if there's any problems. What then happens is that we're basically saying we want to use this image after it's built and packaged the development server. Think of this as basically doing that command as if we were in the UE4 project and going file, package project, and then Win64. In this case, we're just doing it via a command line. This image is a publicly accessible one, and it's worth noting that these built images that you've created for UE4 cannot be published to a public Docker registry. The licensing agreement does not allow that. There is some documents on the website for unrealcontainers.com that specify they are talking about potentially making it possible to authenticate to a private registry and to pull these images, which would save you having to build these images and spend hours doing so, which would be absolutely awesome. But for now, that's not possible, so you had to go through that step to build those images. The UE4 runtime image, if we go to that, is hosted on the standard Docker Hub, if I can get to it. So this is a pre-built image that provides a minimal configured environment for you to be able to run your Unreal Engine project, which is what we want. And basically this command underneath specifies we want to copy from builder, which we've denoted up here. From that container, we want to basically copy the Linux server that was built into this temp project folder, and it ended up in dist Linux server, to a new folder within this container image of home UE4 project. The expose argument down here basically allows us to expose ports. So obviously we want to connect from our game clients to this server via that port. And so we need to expose those, and we'll need to run and publish those ports, which is a different thing, when we run the container image. And then the entry point is basically saying which file, when you do a Docker run and you start this container, what should I basically start from? What should I execute to sort of run as it boots up the container? In this case, there's a vsserver.sh file that is created for us as part of this package process, and we're adding the -log like we've done before when we did the shortcut on Windows in our previous video to then allow the logs to be displayed. Now we have our docker ignore file and our dockerfile.server. We can now test this by bringing up Ubuntu, heading to our Unreal Guide versus Game Unreal directory, so in the root of our project, and then basically type docker build, and we're going to basically point it to the file of the dockerfile.server, and we're going to tag it as vs-server-test and dot to give it the context of the current directory. That should think about it for a little while and basically then run it. It runs a bit quicker on mine because I've got cached layers for this. But ultimately that's now built our dedicated server as a Docker image. And you should be able to see that if you go to Docker for Windows, I'm going to take that away. You should see that we've got VS server -test, and that is the image we have built. Ultimately now what we can do is now run that. So if I do docker run and I give it the tag name vs-server-test, what I should see is Unreal dedicated server up and running as it was before, but rather than it running in Windows, it's now running using Docker in Linux as a built Linux dedicated server. Now we have our working Docker image that builds our Linux dedicated server and can run that dedicated server within Docker. The next thing we're going to do is test our game client's functionality just to make sure that it can connect to our dedicated server that now runs in Docker rather than our local Windows dedicated server. I'm going to bring up the Unreal project, and we've made no changes to this from our previous videos. We're still in the play mode of number of players of 1 and the net mode play standalone. We'll bring up Ubuntu, and basically what we're going to do is start up our server. So we need to do docker run. We need to publish the port so that we can then connect to our container once it's running. So we know that Unreal runs on 7777. So the first is the port of the host and then to the container. And we're going to say the protocol is UDP by putting /UDP. And the tag -t that we built was called VS server -test. So we'll hit that and you can see our game server is now up and running. We'll go back to Unreal Engine and hit play. And we'll do what we've done before, where we'll basically hit the tilde key, hit open as the command, and we'll connect to localhost. And you'll notice it flickered, and for some reason, we're not in the server map. Go into the logs, you can notice that ultimately it did try and connect, but unfortunately the error was that it did some kind of version mismatch. Now, I'm not 100% sure on the answer to this, but I'm quietly confident it's basically because I built the dedicated server using the Unreal engine via Linux, and there's some network mismatch for some reason. And I think it's because I've done that building, whereas this obviously on our local Windows machine is built using the source that we downloaded from GitHub into Windows ourselves, so they're not the same. There is a fix. In later videos we'll go through maybe more of a production ready fix, but for now I'm just going to go through how we can fix this just so we can move forward with these videos. To fix the issue, we're going to create a new game instance class. To do this, we go to C++ classes and we're going to add a new C++ class. We'll show all classes and we're going to pick game instance as our base class. Click next, and then we're going to name this VS game instance. From there we'll create the class, and in Visual Studio we'll then need to reload just so that we can see the new file. Okay, now the files have been created, we're going to basically go into these files for the VS game instance C++ file. I've got one that I prepared earlier just so that you don't have to watch my bad typing. And what we're doing here is including the miscellaneous network version header file. And then we're basically doing an implementation of a virtual function that exists on the game instance class called init. And within here, we're basically saying, here's a directive to say when we're not in shipping mode on the build target, which we're not when we're building because we're currently doing development. We basically say on the is network compatible override, bind this lambda to always return true. So we don't care whether they are a mismatch, just basically allow it. The next thing we'll do is obviously add this to the header file, so we need to create a declaration for that. We've added that into the header file now, and that should build successfully. So if we rebuild, we should see everything works as expected. Now we've created our game instance class, we now need to tell Unreal Engine in our project settings to use this new game instance class rather than the default one. So if we jump over to the Unreal project now and go edit project settings, we should be able to search in the details field for game instance. And you'll notice that we have a game instance property section here that we can just switch out to use VS game instance. We'll save that and close, and we'll do just a compile. and everything's all well and good. Currently we have our dedicated server running in Docker, so we're just going to need to stop that server just now. So if we go into Docker for Windows and go to container/apps, we should be able to find a green box on one of these, which is the running image. So we're going to stop that, and it'll take a couple of seconds, and we should find we get our terminal back. There we go. And then what we need to do is just rebuild the container, and we can use the same command as we did previously to do that. So if we just search for the docker build command and name it the same, this will just take a moment to run through. Okay, so our Docker image is now rebuilt. We can run it again. So if we just do docker run and we publish the port once again, and set the tag, that will start up our server that's been rebuilt. We can go back to the Unreal project and we should be able to now hopefully test to see whether we can connect to the server. So we're in our client map still, and we're going to use the tilde key once again. Open up the connection to the server, and there we go. You can now see we're connected to the server map once again. That wraps up this video of creating your Linux dedicated server and running it via Docker using Docker images from the Unreal Containers project. All credit to Adam Rehn and all the excellent work that's been done thus far around that stuff. In future videos, we're going to talk about how we can now deploy this Docker image and also use it for continuous integration with GitHub Actions. So stay tuned for that.